Hi, everybody. All right. Yeah, thanks for coming to our talk today to learn a little more about ways to design for comfort in VR. My name's Matt Dickman, and I work on our health and safety team here at Oculus. One of the things that's great is I get to drive a lot of our health and safety initiatives by working closely with our different product teams across the business. So safety itself is a core value at Oculus, and the comfort of content is really important as well. The goal of this talk is really to help you understand how we talk about and communicate comfort with our users, how you can incorporate comfort into your development process, and we're going to do a specific deep dive into the Guardian API that Brendan referenced today in the keynote. We'll also reserve some time at the end to go through Q&A, so if you have any questions, there's some mics set up in the middle. So let's start by understanding the comfort of the experience. So a lot of people think of the comfort of the hardware to start, so the ergonomics or the fit on the head. That makes a lot of sense. So our design teams and product teams really they spend a lot of time perfecting this. We actually look more broadly, focusing not just on the comfort of the hardware, but of the content as well. So I think in many ways, the comfort of the content is more important for ensuring a safe and comfortable experience in VR. Much of that control is in your hands as developers. For users, choosing the right content, especially for their first time in VR, is really key. We also find that well-informed users, they're more likely to come back when they've had a positive experience, especially when it's their first time. So we have comfort ratings, and this is really in an effort to help our users make a more informed content decisions. So we have comfortable, moderate, and intense. The goal of this is that the user goes into VR choosing the best possible experience from the start, after which they can explore other types of content. I'm going to go into a bit more detail into what each of these means and what the criteria are that we use to assign some of these. So comfortable content generally avoids camera movement or uncontrolled player motion. As soon as you start to incorporate movement of either the player or of the camera that's following the player, that's when you start getting into these moderate and intense ratings. Now, while these aren't hard, fast rules applied to every single title, they're a good guide to get you started if you're looking for a baseline. So here's a number of the titles that we actually have today in the Oculus store. So what does that mean, comfortable? Comfortable experiences, they're appropriate for most people, though the rating doesn't guarantee that it's going to be comfortable for everyone. Two of my favorites that are up here, one includes Henry, where you really get to see this first-person view of the story unfolding around you, and also Esper, where you get to use ESB to control objects and also to solve through puzzles. Both of these are kind of stationary experiences where you're in a fixed location and you're not moving around and you don't have a lot of external camera movement. So now let's take a look at some of the moderate content. Moderate experiences, they're appropriate for many, but certainly not for everybody. These usually involve the addition of either that camera movement that's watching the player or the player camera itself. Two examples of this. One is Adventure Time, where you have this third-person view which changes as you advance through different scenes while you're controlling the character. Edge of Nowhere is another example, which also gives you this third-person point of view with some of that uncontrolled camera movement as you're going through scene to scene. The inclusion of this camera movement is really one of the primary drivers for why these types of titles have a moderate rating. This brings us to our last category, which is the intense experiences that we have in the store. These typically incorporate significant camera movement, player motion, or even some disorienting effects, often very popular with people that are familiar with a wide range of VR. Examples include The Climb, which we actually use as one of our demos out in a lot of those retail locations. You basically get the feeling of hanging off this sheer cliff, the sheer rock wall. The biggest thing is that this can really elicit strong emotions from people, especially if you're afraid of heights. Omega Agent is another title where you get this first-person perspective of flying in a jetpack, and you have control in all directions. So the fact that the user has this control and that this movement can go in all directions could lead to more or less comfortable experiences. So the rating of these two titles likely comes from the use of these disorienting effects and these camera movements respectively. So it's important to point out, you don't need to have a comfortable rating or intense or be on one end of the spectrum or the other to have a successful title. As you saw from the previous slides, there's a wide range and different assortments of titles that are successful that actually fall into lots of these different categories. What's important is to focus on really designing a great experience. While the goal of the ratings is to provide the user with the best information to choose an experience that would be right for them. With that in mind, there's a number of techniques you as a developer can leverage to deliver the best experience. One of these is comfort modes. So this is typically a functionality that is put into the game or the experience that the user has some control over, that they're either turning on or off during the experience. These ultimately help minimize any discomfort depending on what type of title it is. You can also leverage smart design. So this really is to develop the premise of the game or the experience with comfort in mind in the first place. You can also go further and add extra enhancements or special effects into the content. Again, things that the user would not have to turn on, that it's just built into the experience. Lastly, there's multiple tools available in the Oculus SDK, including this Guardian API, which we'll go into in a little later. So let's see some examples of how these have been implemented to date. So let's start with comfort modes. Here's one example from Dead Secret. So right off the bat, the user is given the option of which comfort mode they'd like to use. There's either a normal setting or a sensitive. So for this case, we'll go in and we'll choose the normal setting. So notice now this first-person character movement. When you select a direction or an action, they're pulled forward at this fixed speed. There's no acceleration, and they're moving in a straight line. Now if we go in and under options and let's turn on that sensitive comfort mode. Once this is enabled, it essentially gives the user, it eliminates that free movement, the camera movement of the user. Now you'll look and see, once enabled, when you select this player movement, you get this blink of an eye followed by a snap to in the location. So what this has done is essentially reduce the possibility of any motion-related or locomotion-related discomfort. So another example of implementing comfort modes is found in Minecraft. So there was a great talk yesterday where they went through in a lot of detail on what the development process was. The first thing you notice when you start is you're informed about this living room mode, and that's what you see here. Essentially, you're in a virtual living room with the screen in front of you of the game experience. You can sit down and play it in the VR. As you look around, you're looking around the room itself. Now we can go and see what happens when you disable this living room mode. What you get is you're slowly drawn back into VR as a user, where you have this first-person view of the environment all around you. And this is pretty typical to what we expect and what we're familiar with in VR, though from a content standpoint, it may not be best for everyone to have that first-person view. So Adrift is another title. So this incorporates comfort modes. Again, right in the beginning of right as you open the game, it shows the options. And here they call it space adaptation syndrome. So, which is actually a real thing for astronauts and in space. But here you're given the option with different keystrokes or commands to be able to turn it on or off. So here you have this first-person view floating through space, and as you enable the mode, it actually knocks down so that it removes a lot of the peripheral view so that you're just focusing on what's dead ahead. So this lack of peripheral information really helps the user focus straight ahead and minimizes a lot of the discomfort. So moving past these comfort modes, we can go into how do you design your experience to be comfortable. And I think Damage Core is a great example of this. So they were able to use comfort and take the idea of not moving around to plan the baseline of the game. So for those unfamiliar, you're able to scan the room, scan the area you're in, and actually transfer to other characters within the environment. You also have an option to switch to an observer mode. So by eliminating this camera movement or uncontrolled player motion, it delivers a great experience for a first-person shooter, which is typically something you would think would be difficult to make. So to have a successful first-person shooter title that's still engaging and doesn't feel like it's broken from a storyline perspective. So let's go one step further from design to implementing specific enhancements into the user experience. So this is Ultra Wings, which is one of the upcoming launch titles for Oculus Touch. This essentially gives you a first-person view of flying an ultralight aircraft while bringing both your hands into the experience. One of the things that's unique and a unique feature of this specific content is you'll notice the windows on either side. So aside from turning on some tunneling effect or blocking out all the peripheral information, here the windows are smoked as you're going forward, and as you look left and right, it actually opens up so you can see clearly without any special input from the users themselves. This is especially useful once you get up into the air and start flying, where a user may be become more susceptible to discomfort tied to different types of locomotion. So this is just one example of how to bring in special features or other effects into your game itself. A number of tools are also available in the Oculus SDK that are there to designed to aid you in actually delivering a more comfortable experience. Now I'd like to hand it over to Dave Linsalata, our product manager for Rift and Touch, to go into a little more detail on this Guardian system. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about Guardian system today. So when I first started working on Rift, I'd go home and I'd play with it a lot. I would go into my small little cramped office space, I'd take my chair, I'd move it out of the way, throw my headset, grab my gamepad, it was fine. And then I started working on Touch. Same thing. Came home, moved my chair out of the way, put on my headset, grabbed my touch controllers, started playing around. Totally fine. That was until I got into this really fun game. I forget what it was. And all of a sudden there was this thunk when my hand hit the bike that I have leaning in my room. And then there's another thunk when the bike fell onto me. And there was a final thunk when I landed on the floor, but didn't break the headset. So I had two takeaways from that. One, I really got to move my bike out of my office. And two, Touch is amazing. It is so much more immersive. And we sort of need to take that into account when we think about design. Matt talked about a lot of that. But on the Oculus side, one thing we really need to do is help the users feel safe while they're in VR in this more immersive experience. So that's what Guardian System is. It's a way to actually let users configure their play space, put up virtual walls that correspond to their real area, and then make sure that they don't actually feel uncomfortable when they're in there and playing in VR. So over the next 15 minutes, what I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of, first, what we were thinking and how we built Guardian. Second, what it currently looks like, still under development. And third, some high-level information on how you can use the API to get information and to control Guardian. Let's start with goals. So the first thing and most important is to help users feel safe. We really wanted people, whether they're moving all around or just standing and gesturing, to feel comfortable and to understand where they are in their space. The second thing is we wanted a simple and robust setup process. We wanted people to easily be able to map their space and, importantly, fix mistakes if they make it. We all make mistakes when we're setting things up for the first time. Third, we wanted to minimize disruption to immersion. Now this is hard, right? Like we are taking all the amazing experiences you guys create and we are putting something up in front of you. But we need to find some way to balance making things clear and understandable in VR without pulling them out of the game too much. And then finally, and no less important than anything else, we need to make sure we have minimal impact on the developer experience, largely by making sure there isn't a performance hit. So that's been a huge focus of this from the start. Now, whenever I'm building a new product, I actually like to have non-goals as well. It helps us focus and make decisions faster. So our two non-goals going into this were, first, we weren't trying to accurately map the room. This is not room reconstruction in some way. This is literally defining where you're going to be playing in VR. And second, we weren't trying to create complex boundaries. Our goal was really to make a wall. It was not to make a wall and then a floor and then a wall and then more floor. So with that in mind, we started to build it. Now, coming up with concepts is easy, right? If there's a problem, I'm sure anyone can come up with any number of solutions. The hard part was actually all the prototyping. And we found that basically all of our successful prototypes, at least when it comes to drawing the 2D in 2D your space for VR, really had three common situations to them. First was they're all intuitive. Now this probably sounds obvious. It's like, of course they should be intuitive when you're mapping your space. But it's actually super hard to make sure that as someone is doing something in 3D space and then seeing a flat screen, top-down view, that they understand how to map between. So that was our first challenge, and every prototype that was successful did that. Our second one was actually to make sure they were accurate. Again, this sounds obvious, but when it comes down to it, there's all these tricks that we came up with. How do we fill in gaps if someone's drawing? How do we smooth out the lines? The problem was, if you do that too much, you might end up creating more problems. For instance, you could create a wall where there actually isn't a wall. Or even worse, you show there's open space when there's a ledge or something like that. I don't know who has a ledge in their room, but you get the point. And finally, they needed to be stable. We came up with some really clever algorithms to try to convert someone's mapped space into something for VR. But the problem was a lot of them, when you started editing and playing around with it, would have the boundaries jump all around. That's not what users want to see. They need to see something simple and clear and intuitive. Most importantly, though, was this last step. It was actually research and feedback. If anyone in the room is part of the group of users and developers that gave us feedback, thank you very much. The feedback we got actually changed a lot, from how we set this up in 2D to how we show it in VR, all the way through to API changes and to what the user options were. But this was a very important part, and we went through a number of iterations to get it right. Now, what we have now isn't final. It's our best attempt right now, and we're going to continue tweaking it before we launch, and we're going to continue working on it after. But let's actually take a look at what the 2D setup looks like, and then we'll take a look at what the VR experience is. At some point, come on. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So when a user first sets up touch, they're prompted to define their guardian boundaries by literally just outlining where they'll be in VR. So to draw, they take a touch controller, pull the trigger, and just walk around the room, and they map it out. Now their goal is to draw a full outline, but we realize people sometimes make mistakes. It's actually hard to get that starting point to match up exactly with the end point, or you might miss something or forget you have a table that's pretty low or something like that. So if that happens, really there's no problem. You can just go back and fill in the gap. As soon as you do that, what we do is we actually draw the largest rectangle possible within that space. We call this the play area, and I'll talk about later how you can actually get information on this. Now, in addition, we want to make it easy for developers to build to a common size for games that require a little bit more movement. So we encourage users to meet a minimum of 2 meters wide by 1.5 meters deep, or about 6.5 feet by 5 feet. Now, it's important to understand we don't actually force users to meet that. Our view is that if a user has a smaller room than that, that's fine. We want them to feel safe while in VR. But at the same time, we're going to do a lot to try to get them up to that 2 by 1.5 size, again, to make it easier for people to develop to a common size. Now, let's say that a user draws it and says, I can make a little more room. I'm going to move something out of the way. That's fine. They literally just go back and they add right on top of that. As they add on to that, we'll adjust the play space, bring it to the new size. And if they've hit a better size, great. We'll tell them, good job, and they can move on. So let's say you've set it up, and you're happy with it now. If you want, you can always edit it later through the app. And you decide you're going to load up Dead and Buried Crow's Canyon and actually play some and see what it looks like. So once you're in VR, the boundaries trigger as 2.5 meter high vertical walls. They're triggered when the headset or when a touch controller gets close to the boundaries that the user has set. Now, two important things. One, we show all boundaries whenever any of them are triggered. And a lot of people might think like, but you're adding so much disruption to this and immersion is going to be broken. Completely hear you. But there's problems if you do that. For instance, if you only do it locally and someone walks backwards and backwards and backwards, they're not seeing what's behind them. So we need to do something so they can quickly understand where they are in their physical space. The second thing is we stomp overall geometry. Again, this is the balance between how do we help users feel safe and how do we do something so that it's not too disruptive. This is where we're coming out right now. We don't, as you'll see, actually pause, nor do we use haptics or sound. We looked into that, but when we thought about it, that was too disruptive, and we didn't want to actually impose that on any of you. If you want to, you're more than welcome to add that. And we'll talk about in the API how you can tell where someone is versus where the boundary is. If any of you have actually played Wilson's Heart, when you go out of tracking on Wilson's Heart, they have a really cool dynamic where your hand turns into a controller and the screen freezes and then eventually, or goes black and white and then freezes. If you want to do something like that, awesome. Now, setting this up requires touch, because as I said, you have to actually draw your space. However, you don't have to be playing a touch game for this to trigger. Similarly, you don't have to be moving around. You could be seated in one space playing a gamepad game, and if Guardian is configured and turned on, we will show the walls. We do want a good experience for users, though. So if a user finds that they have too small of a space or they're just frustrated by it, they can turn it off. We'll encourage them to keep it on, but it is an option they can do. There's also a middle ground, where they can take the walls and just shrink them to a floor outline. I find that to be much more unobtrusive, but still pretty helpful. Speaking of good experience, we found so far that there really is just minimal impact to performance. If any of you are developing and are running Guardian and do find there are problems, please reach out to us right away. Our goal is to make sure, again, this has very minimal impact to no impact, and we want to adjust for that. Finally, again, this is still under development, so what you see here is probably not what we're going to launch with, but it's pretty close. So now let's talk about how you get information through Guardian. So there's basically 4 buckets of information that you can get. First, you can learn if the system is successfully configured or not. Second, you can query for the size of the play area, which is that actual rectangle you mapped out, or the boundary walls itself, as in the whole area. Your choice what you want to use, but obviously we would recommend sticking to that square or sticking to that rectangle and putting your UI there, because again, that is going to be the most common denominator for everyone. Third, you can get all the points on a user's boundary. And fourth, you can actually check if a specific point is going to trigger or is triggering the boundary, and if not, figure out how close it is to that boundary. Now, note that even if Guardian is off, you can still get the information about the play space as long as it's configured. So once a user sets up that space, you can still use that information to customize your UI and make sure they're having a great, cool experience, even if the user doesn't actually want to see the walls. I'll talk a little bit more about how you can get more information about the API later, but for now, let's talk about what you can control. So the first thing is, even if the user isn't actually triggering Guardian, you can actually force on the walls. For instance, if you want to use it to help the user recenter into their space, fine, go ahead. You can't actually force it off, though. Remember, we're trying to help users feel safe. They need to have that consistent level of control themselves. And if suddenly walls didn't appear when they expected them, that could hurt. So we don't want to do that. The other thing is, we understand that you want to make very immersive games. So we're actually letting you change the boundary color. Now, the goal here is for this to blend into your color scheme of your game. So if you have, say, a space game and you make your walls black, we will probably ask you via store policy to not do that, please. At the same time, we know a lot of you actually want to replace the walls with your own custom design. Right? Using that space idea, imagine if you had a holodeck show up as you came in. This is something that we don't currently have available. The reason is, for a V1, we really want to focus on helping users understand, having a consistent look and feel for where Guardian would show up. It is something we are investigating. We'll talk about some other stuff we're looking at in the future. But again, for now, this is just, let's make sure users understand the concept. Similarly, we are not currently letting developers tweak the sensitivity themselves. Looking into it, but we really, again, want to make sure users understand and feel confident in the wall is going to show up here if I'm coming in this fast, no matter if I'm playing one game or another or another. Some other things we're working on in the future. So before we launch, we're going to refine the sensitivity of when Guardian triggers. On one hand, this means balancing how we help users feel safe. But on the other, we recognize that there are going to be a lot of users who don't have a huge space. Some don't even have 2 meters by 1.5. I know I actually don't at home. So what we're going to work on is how do we make sure we're only triggering this when it's needed? We're also just going to be trying to improve the overall experience, whether it's 2D or how the walls show up, how clear they are, et cetera. And finally, we want to refine the wall interactions themselves to make sure we're getting that right balance between immersion and high visibility when the user really needs it. I talked about some of the things we're thinking about for developer control after launch. And we're also going to look into more user control. So there's 3 things that come to mind here. First, we want to let the users control sensitivity themselves in case they want to be a little bit, have it trigger a little faster. Second, we want to let them control the color. And third, we want to let them control the design themselves. And then finally, one thing that I'm actually pretty excited about is we want to let people control the Guardian setting on a per app basis. The reason for this is if we don't do this, there's a chance users turn it on, turn it off, and have to do it globally each time. And we really want to say, hey, user, you know you have a game that's super active. Awesome, you keep it on. And then they have a game that is just stationary, sitting there and maybe playing a gamepad. Awesome, they remember they're going to keep it off because they don't really need it. Again, all this stuff is things we're looking into. But that's just what we have top of mind. Now, we're really excited to launch Guardian. And if you want to learn more about the actual API, I'd encourage you to check out this talk by Paul Pedriana. Unfortunately, this was supposed to be right after our talk, which would have been a great segue. It's actually happening right now. So 2 options for you guys. Well, 3. 1, you can run out of the room right now, which would be sad, but you can do it. The second is you can look at Paul's talk afterwards. We're going to record all these talks. And the third is you can reach out to me, Matt, or anyone on the DevRel team, and we'll get you the information you need so that you feel like you can develop with Guardian. Now back to Matt to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's great. Yeah, we're very excited for Guardian to come out and to add this other level of experience for the user to give some control over the comfort of their experience and with new content titles. So to recap, a number of tools and techniques available to you as a developer that you can use to improve the comfort and design of your experiences. So comfort modes, designing for comfort in the first place, and leveraging our Oculus SDK with things like Guardian or the asynchronous time warp or even space warp that was announced today at the keynote. So the biggest thing is that comfort is more of a game design challenge than it is a constraint of VR. So this is something you're definitely going to want to think of and try to solve for as you develop new and inventive experiences. Everyone's a little different, and it's important to take your core users' sensitivities to heart. We're excited to see kind of what new techniques and applications that come out. A lot of what we looked at today, while great examples, these are just showing other developers means of experimenting with different techniques and styles of adding this type of comfort mode. So certainly not a requirement, but some nice examples that go through. So what areas can we collectively focus on and experiment with as VR continues to grow? Some of the things we're including, one would be new means of rating and hosting content on the Oculus Store. Another thing in the keynote was this new education section, which I think is great to be able to add new pockets of information and ways for users to get right to the content that that would be most appropriate for them. Another is taking our traditional warnings, which are typically written or text, and improving comprehension by maybe adding animation and incorporating that, whether it's into the product or into the NUX, the new user experience. Finally, we're definitely going to come across new challenges and opportunities as we push the boundaries to develop new hardware designs, as highlighted by Mark Zuckerberg, showing some of that prototype once you are able to actually cut the wire and you're not tethered to the PC anymore. So with all of these in mind, I think there's a lot of opportunities to grow and improve, but certainly some of the areas that we're looking into and looking forward to. So thanks again for coming. Happy to now open it up and with any questions that the group may have.